The wind howled like a wounded beast, tearing through the night with icy claws. Snow swirled in furious gusts, swallowing the road whole. Visibility was zero, and the cold, it bit deep enough to freeze bones. But in the heart of the storm, a single farmhouse light flickered defiantly. Inside, John Carter stoked the fireplace, his rough hands calloused from decades of tending the land. He wasn't expecting visitors. Nobody sane would be out in this. Then a pounding at the door. John hesitated. Strangers in a storm could mean trouble, but the thought of someone freezing to death on his porch, that wasn't something he could live with. He swung the door open and the blizzard nearly knocked him back. A young woman, Sarah Mitchell, stood shivering, her coat dusted white, her lips blue. My car slid into a ditch," she stammered. Behind her, headlights barely pierced the snow, two more vehicles abandoned, their drivers stranded. John didn't ask questions. "Get inside," he ordered, ushering her toward the fire. As Sarah collapsed onto the couch, another knock came. This time it was David Reynolds, a stiff-shouldered man in a too-thin suit, his expensive shoes ruined by the snow. He looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "I don't want to impose," David muttered, but the chattering of his teeth betrayed him. Then the third knock. A silent man, Officer Mark Harris, stepped inside, snow clinging to his dark jacket. His eyes scanned the room like he was memorizing it. Something about him felt off. But the storm raged louder and John shoved his unease aside. For tonight, this farmhouse was a refuge. What he didn't know, one of them wasn't who they claimed to be, and by morning nothing would be the same. John tossed another log into the fireplace, the flames crackling to life as warmth slowly seeped back into the room. Sarah sat closest to the heat, rubbing her hands together, her breath still uneven from the cold. "I was on my way to the hospital," she admitted, her voice quiet but steady now. "Night shift. Didn't think the storm would get this bad." John nodded, handing her a chipped mug of steaming tea. "Lucky you made it here," he said. "Roads'll be buried by morning." Across the room, David hovered near the doorway as if debating whether he should stay. His expensive watch glinted in the firelight, out of place against the worn farmhouse walls. "You got a phone?" he asked abruptly. "Mine's dead." John shook his head. "Landline down. Storm took out the lines hours ago." David's jaw tightened, but he said nothing else, just stared into the fire like it held answers. Officer Harris was the last to settle in, choosing a chair near the window where he could see the driveway. He hadn't spoken much since arriving, just a quiet thanks when John handed him a blanket. But his eyes, sharp, alert, kept drifting toward David. Not in suspicion exactly, more like recognition. John busied himself in the kitchen, pulling out bread, cheese, a pot of stew he'd made the night before. "Ain't much," he said, setting bowls on the table, "but it's hot." Sarah was the first to move, gratitude softening her face. "You're saving our lives," she said, and the sincerity in her voice made John's chest tight. It had been a long time since someone looked at him like that. David hesitated, then sat stiffly, picking at his food like he was afraid it might poison him. "You live out here alone?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes calculating. John shrugged. "Since my wife passed." The words still tasted bitter even after all these years. David opened his mouth, maybe to offer condolences, maybe to pry further, but Officer Harris cut in. "Storm's supposed to last till dawn," he said, his voice low. "We're not going anywhere tonight." Something unspoken passed between the two men, a tension that had nothing to do with the weather. John felt it, like the charged air before lightning strikes, but Sarah, oblivious, smiled at him. "Tell us about the farm," she said. "How long have you been here?" And so John did. He talked about the land, the seasons, the way the fields turned gold in the fall. He didn't mention the loneliness, the way the silence sometimes pressed in so heavy he could barely breathe. But as the fire burned and the wind screamed outside, something strange happened. The house didn't feel so empty anymore. Until a sharp click cut through the conversation. Officer Harris had set his phone on the table. The screen was dark, but the sound, deliberate, intentional, made David freeze mid-bite. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then Harris leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "Funny thing about storms," he said. "They have a way of trapping things that don't want to be caught." The room went very, very still. The fire popped sharply, breaking the silence that had settled over the room like a shroud. Sarah glanced between the men, her spoon hovering halfway to her mouth. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice too loud in the sudden quiet. Officer Harris didn't answer. His eyes stayed locked on David, who had gone pale beneath his carefully maintained tan. John felt the shift in the air, the way David's fingers twitched toward his coat pocket, the way Harris's shoulders tensed, ready to move. Instinct made him step between them, his farmer's hands raised in a placating gesture. "Now hold on," he said, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. "Whatever's going on here, it can wait till morning. Nobody's going anywhere in that mess outside." For a long moment, no one moved. Then David let out a slow breath and leaned back in his chair, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You're right," he said smoothly. "Just tired, long drive." But his knuckles were white where they gripped the edge of the table. Sarah looked ready to argue, but a particularly violent gust of wind rattled the windows, reminding them all of the storm's fury. The tension eased, but didn't disappear. It lingered in the way Harris kept his phone close, in the way David's gaze kept darting to the door. John cleared the dishes, his mind racing. He wasn't a fool. Something was happening here, something dangerous. But the part of him that had spent a lifetime helping strays, both animal and human, couldn't bring himself to turn anyone out into the storm. Not even a man who made his skin prickle with warning. As the night deepened, Sarah yawned, her adrenaline clearly fading. "I hate to ask," she said sheepishly, "but is there somewhere I could lie down?" John nodded, leading her to the small guest room that had once been his wife's sewing space. The sheets were dusty but clean, and Sarah sank onto the bed with a grateful sigh. "Thank you," she murmured, already half asleep, "for everything." Back in the living room, David had claimed the couch, his body angled away from Harris, who had taken up a post in the armchair by the fire. The officer's posture was deceptively relaxed, but John noticed the way his hand rested near his waist, where a gun might be if he carried one. John tossed another log on the fire. "You two know each other?" he asked quietly. Harris's mouth quirked. "You could say that." David didn't turn around, but his shoulders stiffened. The wind howled outside, a mournful sound that set John's teeth on edge. He thought about his wife, about how she'd always said his kindness would get him into trouble one day. Maybe she'd been right. But as he looked at the two men, one hiding something, the other hunting, he realized something with sudden clarity. This wasn't just a storm outside. It was a storm inside these walls, too, and when it broke, there'd be no shelter from the fallout. Harris caught his eye and gave a slight shake of his head, a silent warning. John swallowed hard and turned toward the kitchen, pretending to busy himself with the dishes. But his mind was racing, pieces clicking into place. David wasn't just a stranded traveler. Harris wasn't just a cop. And this night wasn't going to end with a handshake and a thank you. Somewhere in the house, a floorboard creaked. John froze, water dripping from his hands into the sink. The sound hadn't come from the living room. Someone else was moving in the dark. The storm outside might have been raging, but the real danger was already inside. The creak came again, closer this time. John turned off the faucet, water droplets falling like whispers into the silent sink. His reflection in the darkened window showed wide eyes, the pulse in his throat hammering. He wasn't alone in the kitchen. A shadow moved near the pantry. John's fingers closed around the cast-iron skillet on the counter. Not a weapon, but it would do. "Show yourself," he demanded, his voice low. Sarah stepped into the dim light, her hands raised. "It's just me," she whispered. Her face was drawn, all traces of sleep gone. "I couldn't rest, not with whatever's happening out there." She jerked her chin toward the living room where Harris's silhouette sat motionless by the fire. John lowered the skillet, but the tension didn't leave his shoulders. "You heard." "Enough," Sarah bit her lip. "That man, David, he's in trouble, isn't he?" Before John could answer, a floorboard groaned in the hallway. They both froze as David's voice floated through the darkness, tight with forced calm. "Bathroom's down here, right?" Harris's response was ice. "Don't move." A scuffle, a thud. John and Sarah rushed into the hallway just as David slammed Harris against the wall, a glint of metal in his hand, a knife from John's own kitchen block. "You think I don't know who you are?" David spat, pressing the blade to Harris's throat. "You've been tailing me since Chicago." Sarah gasped. John lunged forward, but Harris moved faster, a brutal elbow to David's ribs, a twist that sent the knife clattering to the floor. In one fluid motion, Harris had David face down on the ground, his knee planted between the man's shoulder blades. Then came the click of handcuffs. Sarah stumbled back. "Oh my God." Harris ignored her, yanking David upright. "David Reynolds," he said, his voice colder than the storm outside. "You're under arrest for embezzlement, wire fraud, and the attempted murder of a federal witness." He reached into his jacket and flipped open a badge, FBI, gleaming in the firelight. John's breath left him in a rush. None of this was real. It couldn't be. But David's next words made it undeniable. "You'll never make it stick," he snarled. "My lawyers." "We'll have a field day," Harris finished. "But first, you've got to survive the night." He glanced at John, something almost apologetic in his gaze. "The storm trapped him here. Your kindness kept him still long enough for backup to surround the area." As if on cue, headlights cut through the blizzard outside, 2, then 4, then a dozen, forming a circle around the farmhouse. Red and blue lights pulsed against the snow. Sarah made a small, shocked noise. You used us as bait." Harris's jaw tightened. "I didn't expect civilians to be involved, but Reynolds here picked your car to follow when the storm hit, thought blending in would throw us off." He hauled David toward the door. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry." John stared at the man he'd let into his home, the criminal who'd sat at his table, eaten his food. The world tilted under his feet. All these years alone, all the quiet nights wondering if his life meant anything. And in one evening, he'd helped catch a fugitive. The front door burst open, letting in a swirl of snow and uniformed officers. As they dragged David away, Harris paused on the threshold. "You did good tonight," he said to John. Then he was gone, swallowed by the storm. Sarah's hand found John's, her fingers trembling. Neither of them spoke. Outside, the wind howled like it was laughing at them. Inside, the fire burned low, and John Carter, simple farmer, stood very still, wondering if he'd ever look at strangers the same way again. The farmhouse felt hollow after the FBI left, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, clutching a fresh mug of tea between her hands, the steam curling around her face. She hadn't stopped shaking since the door closed behind Harris. "I can't believe it," she murmured for the third time. "He was just sitting there with us, eating your stew." John stared out the window at the retreating taillights, now just faint red smudges in the swirling snow. His reflection stared back, an old man with tired eyes and a jaw clenched tight enough to ache. He should have been angry. Maybe he was, underneath the numbness. But another feeling pressed heavier against his ribs, the weight of something unfinished. "He thanked me," John said suddenly, the words rough. "Harris said I did good." He turned away from the window, the floorboards creaking under his boots, like I was part of some damn sting operation. Sarah's eyes softened. "You saved lives tonight, mine for starters." She hesitated, then added quietly, "You didn't have to open that door." John exhaled sharply through his nose. No, he hadn't. And if he'd known what was coming, would he have? The question coiled in his gut like a snake. The storm raged on outside, but the house was warmer now, the fire built back up. Sarah insisted on washing the dishes. "You cooked, it's the least I can do," and John let her, watching as she scrubbed David's bowl with particular vigor. The mundane act of cleaning up after a criminal felt absurd, almost funny. Or it would have, if laughter didn't threaten to turn into something else entirely. "You should try to sleep," John said at last. "Roads'll be plowed by dawn. You can get to your hospital shift." Sarah set the last dish on the rack with a clink. "Actually," she wiped her hands on her jeans, avoiding his eyes, "I was thinking I might stay a few days, help around the farm if you'll have me." John stilled. "Why?" She met his gaze then, and the determination in her surprised him. "Because nobody should be alone after a night like this. And because—" a faint smile touched her lips. "I think your wife would have wanted someone to make sure you eat something besides stew." The mention of his wife hit like a punch to the chest. John opened his mouth, closed it. The words "I don't need charity" died on his tongue. Because the truth was, the thought of returning to an empty house tomorrow, of pretending none of this happened, made his hands twitch with something like panic. A log shifted in the fireplace, sending up a shower of sparks. "All right," John said gruffly. Sarah nodded, like she'd expected nothing less. Morning came brittle and bright, the storm leaving behind a world glazed in ice. John stepped onto the porch, his breath fogging in the air, and took in the tire tracks cutting through his field, the only evidence of last night's chaos. His fingers tightened around the mug of coffee Sarah had pressed into his hands before shooing him outside. "You've got a visitor," she called from the doorway. John turned as a familiar black SUV crunched up the driveway. Harris stepped out, looking exhausted but clean-shaven, his badge clipped to his belt. No hiding now. "Mr. Carter," Harris nodded, "thought you deserved an explanation." John sipped his coffee. "I'm listening." Over the next hour, the story unfolded. David Reynolds, CFO of some big-shot investment firm, skimming millions from pension funds. The whistleblower found beaten half to death in a parking garage. The months-long manhunt that led Harris to this stretch of rural highway just as the storm hit. "In my farm?" John asked. Harris's mouth quirked. "Dumb luck. Reynolds picked your place because it was the only light he could see. We lost him in the snow until he stopped moving." He reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope. "This is from the Bureau, a token of appreciation." John didn't take it. "Keep your money." Harris sighed like he'd expected this. "There's something else." He nodded toward the SUV, where another agent was unloading a wooden crate. "Turns out Reynolds had a safe house nearby. We found these there." The crate opened to reveal a stack of photo albums, a jewelry box John would know anywhere, and a framed picture of his wife laughing on their wedding day. Items stolen from his house during a break-in 6 months ago. John's knees nearly buckled. "Reynolds had a thing for sentimental value," Harris said quietly. "We'll need to keep them as evidence for a while, but—" Sarah's hand gripped John's elbow, steadying him. He couldn't speak, couldn't think past the roaring in his ears. That bastard had been in his home before, had touched Mary's things, had. "John," Sarah's voice was gentle, "breathe." He did, dragging air into his lungs like a drowning man. When he finally trusted himself to look up, Harris was watching him with something like respect. "You're a good man, Mr. Carter," the agent said. "The world could use more of that." Then he was gone, leaving behind the winter sunlight and the ghosts of the past, and the unexpected presence of a stranger who, against all odds, was starting to feel like something like family. John turned to Sarah. "You still want to stay a few days?" She smiled. "Try getting rid of me." And for the first time in years, the farmhouse didn't feel so empty. The first daffodils were pushing through the thawing earth when Sarah's car finally crunched down the gravel driveway for what she insisted was just a visit. John watched from the porch, the morning sun warm on his back, as she emerged with arms full of grocery bags and that determined set to her jaw he'd come to know so well. "You're out of eggs," she announced, as if 3 weeks away had been a mere inconvenience to his kitchen operations. Behind her, a lanky teenager, one of her ER patients, she explained, unloaded bags of feed from her trunk without being asked. The local paper, yellowed from weeks on John's counter, rustled in the breeze. Beneath the headline "Fugitive CFO Captured in Dramatic Winter Standoff," a smaller photo showed John's farmhouse, his own blurred figure in the doorway. He'd refused interviews, but the story had legs of its own. Strangers waved now when he went to town. The waitress at the diner gave him free pie. Sarah set the groceries on the table with a thump, eyeing the newspaper. "Regretting your 15 minutes of fame yet?" John snorted, handing her a mug. "Still think you'd have made a better front-page star." She grinned, but her eyes were serious when she looked around the kitchen, at the reclaimed photo albums on the shelf, the new curtain she'd helped hang, the second-place setting that hadn't been packed away since the storm. "Place looks good," she said softly. Outside, the teenager whistled as he mucked out the barn, his voice carrying on the spring air. The coffee steamed between John's palms, rich and dark. Somewhere between that first knock in the blizzard and this quiet morning, the world had gotten bigger. Not easier, no, but lighter. John lifted his mug in silent toast. To strangers who became family, to justice served in unlikely ways, to the stubborn kindness that kept his door unlocked even now. Sarah clinked her cup against his, and the morning stretched on, full of ordinary, extraordinary promise.